In this presentation, we will animate and render this dragonfly scene. We will not only animate the different parts of the dragonfly, such as the tail and the wings, but we will also animate the disturbance on the surface of the water. And then we will use Render Zone for the final rendering of the animation, including all the special effects, such as the lens flare and depth blur. Let's see how this was done. We begin by animating the different parts of the dragonfly. There are many ways to animate objects in formz. One way is to keyframe animate. What that allows us to do is highlight the object, use the keyframe animation tool, and as we move down the timeline, we'll transform the object and tell formz where that object needs to be at certain points in time. So as we move the timeline, we move the object, and as we move the timeline back and forth, you can see that formz automatically interpolates through those keyframe positions. We can also open the Animation Editor dialog box and get a graphical representation of the keyframe information. And you can see that we can change those keyframe values here graphically. We can also modify them by typing in numeric information. Let's animate some of the other parts of our dragonfly. For example, the back tail. Well, we can use the deformation tool, maybe do a radial bend, grab the object and bend that any angle that we want. And of course, all these deformation parameters can be animated. So what we can do is maybe go to the keyframe value for that angle. And what we can do is see that you can graphically, take that single keyframe value for the radial bend angle, modify that. We can change that over time by creating our own animation graphically right here in the Animation Editor dialog box by creating our own graph. We can also change those values by adding additional controllers to create the graph for us. If we undo a few steps back, you can see that we can take that angle animation track there and add a noise controller. What that does is creates a random graph for us within any range that we want. So for example, let's say plus or minus 90 degrees. And you can see it automatically creates that for us. So now as we move the timeline, you can see that the back tail section is radial bending randomly plus or minus 90 degrees over time. And now here we have all the rest of the parts of our dragonfly animated. We can take all these different pieces and animation tracks and combine those together into animation groups. And then we can take that single animation group and have that animate along a path. Now this is a spline curve created using the drawing tools in formz. And we'll just animate the group along the path. Now to create the water, we'll just maybe create a solid box for that. And because of the object-centric animation in formz, we can edit the geometry even after it's animated. It's a seamless integration between the modeling and rendering capabilities of formz. So we'll just edit that curve and push it down inside the water. So now the dragonfly dips down into the water there. Now as he hits the water, we want to create a disturbance on the surface. So we'll use the deformation tools in formz to create a circular disturbance on the surface of that object. We can do a circular, linear, or random type disturbances on the surface of any type of object. And all we have to do is animate two different parameters, the height of the wave and the offset of the wave. So as the dragonfly hits the water, the height jumps up to a value and then gradually drops down to 0, and the offset is just the actual distance of the wave. So as you make that larger and larger, the rings of water will radiate from the center. All right. So next, let's go ahead and render the dragonfly scene. We begin by creating a larger pond, which is really just a larger box. And then we have the dragonfly animated along a longer path, more complicated spline curve. And what we'll do is begin by modifying the surface style parameters. For example, the water. Let's give that a transparency so we can see through the water. And in the original movie, you can see the bottom of the pond. So we'll recreate that by just creating another box on the bottom. And we'll put a surface style texture image map of rocks onto that surface of that box on the bottom. Of course, if you want to actually model all the rocks, that's fine. formz has plenty of modeling tools. For example, the surface subdivision tool that you can just start with just a simple cube and mold that into an organic shape. The rest of the scene, the trees in the background and the grass, is just simply some image maps onto some flat surfaces. The grass is actually on a extruded spline. It's a flat surface, but you can see that you can edit the surface or the shoreline by modifying that geometry. And notice the parametric mapping allows the grass to stay fixed onto that surface. Now next we need to create the view, so we can maybe save a few views here, and we want to animate that over time. So one other way to animate objects in formz is to give it the animation keyframe objects. For example, just pick a series of views, and formz can then animate through those views to create the animated camera following the dragonfly. Now at this point, let's move the timeline and stop anywhere along our frames here, and maybe instead of interactive shaded OpenGL, let's use render zone, do a full render zone ray trace rendering of the scene. And this is looking a little better. We need to modify the water and make it look a little more realistic. So we'll go to the predefined materials that come with formz. We'll choose the water category. Notice that based on the water that we choose, we can have an index of refraction value. So light will actually bend or refract as it goes through that material. We can also add some other effects. Let's say it's a hot, steamy day and there's a little bit of mist on the surface of the water. We can go to the scene parameters here. We can add a depth effect such as rain, snow, fog, or depth cube. In this case we'll put fog, but we don't want to add it to the entire scene. We'll just put a little thin layer of ground fog and just on the top surface of that water. The render zone rendering's done. We can add some additional post-process effects if we want. For example, we can change the background image. Actually, we can make it anything we want. We can use a procedural such as polka dots. We can load any type of image map. There's even a procedural sky background if we want. And notice that the scene does not re-render. Even though it's a rendered image, it still has the 3D depth information and the alpha channel information, so you can just sort of add that background image after it's rendered. We can also add some depth blur, so it looks like a photographic image. There's two planes that we move back and forth, so we can have the front blurry and the back blurry, and the middle is focused. Or we can reduce the near blur, and everything in the center will be nice and focused, just like a camera lens. And we can modify these depth blur parameters without re-rendering that image. Lens flares, very easy to add. formz automatically highlights hot spots on surfaces or direct exposure to a light source. Just choose the shape of lens that you want. You can even sort of modify the intensity and size if you want, and that then is superimposed into the rendered image. Now that we're done setting these parameters, you can see that you can move anywhere along that timeline sequence, and it'll re-render that frame and then just add all those additional post-process effects to that in a single rendering pass. So all we have to do then is render all those frames out in order to create the final animation movie as we see here. And notice that the lens flare is automatically animated by formz as the camera angle changes. This concludes the demonstration of the dragonfly scene, which was all modeled, rendered, and animated all within formz.